Good afternoon, everyone. This is Laura Pimentel from the Literacy Funders Network. We're just waiting until 2 o'clock, a few more minutes, and then we'll officially begin the broadcast of the LFN webinar. If you can let us know if you can hear us. If there's any technical difficulties, please put them in the questions or the chat section on the side of your screen. We'll start momentarily. Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to start the Future of Literacy Funding webinar of Federal Budget Review and its Impact on Adult Education. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. It's so important to have philanthropy at the table for this discussion, as private funders can make a big difference in how literacy dollars are spent. By supplying unrestricted funding, you all can help fill in the gaps for adult education, which are left by the federal government. Also, as investors, with every dollar your foundations give to literacy, you show the government the importance of literacy and that it continues to matter to the private sector. Your funding is not only helping reaching people who need literacy services, it's also a subtle form of advocacy. We need your continued support and help to reach the many adult learners, programs that serve them, and public and private funders. This is Laura Pimentel. I am the Vice President of the Literacy Funders Network and Director of Development at ProLiteracy. Today, I'd like to thank Amanda Bergson-Shilcock and Michelle Dichek for joining us today, as well as the Literacy Funders Network for putting this webinar together. The Literacy Funders Network increases the philanthropic community's knowledge and understanding of literacy as a systemic issue and a tool for community change, and is a venue for collaboration and collective impact. As an affinity group with the Council on Foundations, we continue to explore literacy funding through our annual conference, webinars, and group discussions. Today's session will be recorded. A link will be emailed in a few business days. All participants are on mute right now. If you have a question for our panelists, please enter it into the questions box on the right side of your screen. Also, let us know if you have any technical or sound issues in that box as well. We will be holding all questions to the end when we'll have about 20 minutes for the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists and hand it over to them. Here today we have Michelle Dichek, the Director of Programs from ProLiteracy. Michelle is responsible for the overall strategic direction and management of ProLiteracy's domestic and international initiatives, including professional development, membership, credentialing, advocacy and awareness efforts, and other grant and special projects that support the mission of ProLiteracy. Michelle has been with ProLiteracy in different capacities for almost 23 years. And ProLiteracy promotes adult literacy education through content development, programs, and advocacy. Our goal is to help literacy programs increase the quality and quantity of services provided. We also have with us Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, who is the Director of Upskilling Policy at the National Skills Coalition. Amanda spent 9 years working in adult education at the community level before coming to NSC in 2015. NSC is a broad-based coalition of adult educators, workforce development professionals, community colleges, businesses, labor unions, and others who share an interest in making sure that every worker has the skills they need to compete and prosper. NSC collaborates closely with its members to advance strong adult education and skills policies at the state and federal level. I'd like to now turn it over to Amanda Bergson-Shilcock for today's conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Lara, and thanks to the Literacy Funders Network for making today's webinar possible. We're going to go through some background information, some updates on the federal budget process, and then a couple of notes about resources that may be useful to you as adult education funders and advocates. And as Lara mentioned, we're also, after we hear from Michelle, going to have time for questions. If a question comes up as I'm talking, you're welcome. If it's just a quick clarifying question and you want to type it into the question box, that's fine, but we really will be holding most of the questions until the end of today's webinar. So what are we going to work through today? Well, you see the agenda on the slide before you, talking a little bit about the changes in the political landscape and the current status of the budget. As you all may have seen, there were some developments on Capitol Hill on Sunday night, and so I have some updates for you on that front. And then, as I said, some issues on the horizon. We're going to go to the next slide now. So let's just pull back the camera lens for just a second. In general, President Trump has not talked about adult education very much at all. Certainly he campaigned on jobs, but there really was not a focus on either job training or adult education as part of the campaign nor during the transition. His cabinet secretary nominees also do not come to the table with a background in adult education. Secretary DeVos, of course, has taken office. She has, since she's taken office, been able to tour some community colleges and career and technical education programs, and just recently met with COABE and the state directors of adult education. So she's getting up to speed on adult education issues, but does not come in with that background. Her primary focus has been on K-12 education, as many of you probably know. Secretary Acosta at the Department of Labor side also does not come in with a deep background in adult education, and he has just been confirmed and just actually sent out his welcome message to DOL staff on Friday. So there's not a deep bench in the sense of the immediate expertise on adult education in the new administration, and we're waiting to see how that's going to get built out with additional staff at both the Department of Education and Labor. So let's turn to Congress. Obviously, Republicans maintain control of both chambers. However, there are tighter margins, and the Democrats have a filibuster on most issues, which means for most things that the Republicans would want to do, including passing budgets, they need to get 8 Democratic votes because they're going to need 60 votes to pass most of what they want to do. One sort of bright spot on the Hill is I've talked to a lot of congressional offices. There is continuing pride over the fact that WIOA was an overwhelmingly bipartisan piece of legislation, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was reauthorized in July of 2014, and of course includes Title II, which is the biggest federal investment in adult education. And so that is, frankly, in a spring that's been more full of raw feelings on a bipartisan level on the Hill, adult education and skills issues more broadly remain a bright spot. There are a lot of things that are on the congressional agenda this spring. There's still attempts to work on health care. It's not clear what will happen with that, but health care is one issue that Republicans are trying to tackle through the budget reconciliation process, so that's one area where they wouldn't need 60 votes necessarily, depending on exactly what they're trying to move. Tax proposals, you all heard the president has a general outline of what he'd like to see happen, and there's been quite a lot of talk about infrastructure. There isn't yet actual infrastructure legislation that's been fleshed out. So there's a lot of questions about what Congress, frankly, has time to do in the time left in their session in the rest of this year, and what they can do with only 51 votes versus what they would need 60 votes to accomplish. And as I said, for most of what they're trying to do, unless they're doing it through the budget reconciliation process, they do need 60 votes, and that means they need Democrats. So next slide, please. So let's talk about where things stand with federal funding for adult education and literacy in particular. Congress, as you may have heard, has reached a bipartisan budget deal. Right now we're running on a very short-term, one-week-long continuing resolution. That happened over the weekend and really just averted a government shutdown. So it gives us a week through Friday, and the budget bills that Congress has agreed on are expected to formally pass this week. The vote is scheduled for Thursday, so going right down to the wire. And the way the budget works is, of course, it's 11 separate funding bills, and the one of most interest to adult education is the Labor Ed HHS bill, which combines labor, education, and health and human services funding. Basically, what is in the proposal for the rest of this fiscal year is essentially level funding. Certainly for adult education, but also for a lot of workforce programs. And that is for the year ending September 30th. Next slide. Of course, FY17 is halfway over by now, so we're already looking forward to FY18, which is the fiscal year that begins on October 1st. The president released a so-called skinny budget in March. A skinny budget is just something that presidents release in the first year of their first term, and it's called that because it doesn't contain as much detail as a full budget proposal. And the reason it doesn't contain as much detail, of course, is because if a president has just taken office, they haven't had the time to really flesh out as detailed a proposal as they might in other years. The president's skinny budget, frankly, proposed dramatic cuts in many areas, including in education. It is only a sort of general outline. The president's full budget is likely to come in a couple of weeks in the middle of May, although that timeline's been pushed a little bit, so it might be a little bit later in May. Next slide, please. In particular, with regard to education, the skinny budget proposes a 13% cut in the U.S. Department of Education budget. It did not specifically mention adult education grants under WIOA. So the fact that they're not singled out for cuts may suggest level funding, but frankly, we can't count on that. Turning to the Department of Labor, the Labor Department saw even larger cuts recommended by the president's skinny budget. And so in the next slide, you'll see that the skinny budget recommends a 21% cut for the Department of Labor across a range of programs, some of which were not spelled out explicitly, some of which were, including the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Titles 1 and 3, which are some of the DOL pieces of WIOA. So that's what the president put out there in March. That skinny budget, frankly, was not very popular on Capitol Hill. Neither Republicans nor Democrats were particularly enthused about what was being recommended there. Next slide. So while we're still waiting for the president's full budget, this is an important slide to keep in mind, particularly for those of you who may be engaged in advocacy on some level. Whatever is proposed by the president's FY18 full budget, and I think we can assume there are going to continue to be cuts proposed, this is coming into an adult education system that has already survived substantial cuts over the past decade or so. And so, as you can see in the bottom line of this chart, the orange line at the bottom, back in fiscal year 2001, adult education was receiving about $734 million in inflation-adjusted terms. Today, that number is $581 million. So even if we, quote, win and get level funding, we're really talking about a system that has continued to lose capacity because of lack of congressional investment. And I think that's really important when we think about the base of adult learners that we're trying to serve in our communities and the importance of the organizations that many of you on this webinar are supporting through your grant making, is that they're doing this in an environment in which the need for adult education continues to grow and the federal investment in adult education continues to shrink. So I think that's an important sort of big picture piece of context as we head into these federal budget discussions. Next slide. So the president's skinny budget also proposed a huge range of other cuts, and I wanted to lift them up because these are often not talked about in the context of adult education. But there are cities and communities all over the country that are using funding from these grants to support GED or high school equivalency classes, to support English for speakers of other languages classes, to support other kinds of adult education activities. So CSBG money, which comes through the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, DBG money, which comes through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. These are designed for low-income populations, designed for communities to get as block grants. Many states and localities then turn around and use some of those block grants to support programs for adult learners. IMLS grants, those go to public libraries, oftentimes in partnership with other organizations. So many libraries use those IMLS grants to support computer classes for adult learners, job clubs for adult learners, English language classes, other kinds of activities to support adult learners. And then critically, cutting across many areas of the nonprofit sector, CNCS, the Corporation for National and Community Service, supports AmeriCorps Vista members, and many of you are likely familiar with and have worked with AmeriCorps Vista partners in your community to support adult education and literacy, programs. And I mention all of this to say that as this budget debate moves forward in Congress, it's important to not just zero in on one line item in the budget and think, okay, well, if Leo is level funded, then adult ed is okay. Because in reality, there are all of these other ways that the federal government supports states and localities in investing in adult education. And if there are cuts in other aspects of the federal budget, that is going to jeopardize communities' ability to keep providing these services. Next slide. So where's Congress in all of this? Right? So Congress has come to this bipartisan budget deal on the end of FY17. As I said, that runs through September 30th. We're expecting that bill will get passed this week. Then we turn immediately in the next few weeks to FY18. And Congress will set, will issue a budget resolution that sets caps for the appropriators, sort of gives a top dollar amount, and then lets the appropriators sort of duke it out about how to divvy up those dollars. I think we're likely to see a repeat of some of the same issues in FY17, which is to say, if conservatives in Congress want to see more money in the defense budget, Democrats will want to see more money in the non-defense budget. And to say, if you're going to lift the cap for military spending, you should also be lifting a cap or setting a cap at an appropriate level for non-defense discretionary, which is a very jargony term that's used on the Hill to refer to everything that is not the military and not an entitlement, that is not Social Security or Medicare spending. So NDD, non-defense discretionary, is where everything that we have just been talking about on today's webinar, the education, the labor, the health and human services, the community development, the AmeriCorps Vista, the library services, every one of those things falls under that umbrella of NDD. As I mentioned, there's also some unknowns around the budget reconciliation process. The original goal of Republican leadership in Congress had been to use the FY17 budget reconciliation process to do their health care reform proposal, and then use the FY18 budget reconciliation to do their tax reform proposal. You may have noticed they haven't passed their health care reform proposal, so that's sort of creating a bit of a traffic jam in terms of what they had hoped to have on their legislative agenda. So there's a lot of unknowns still, and I think it's important to know that this is a picture that's going to change somewhat rapidly over the next few weeks, and will be important for those of you who are sort of monitoring what's going on in Washington. We at NSC regularly do blog posts and bulletins to sort of update people about key developments, but you may also belong to funders collaboratives or others that are keeping a finger on the pulse of this, and it's going to be a very busy spring. And I think, you may know something 1 week and 2 days later, the picture may be very different. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does this actually mean for programs in your community. We talked a little bit about this before when we were looking at the line chart of showing budget cuts over the past 10, 15 years. Even level funding, which we might view as kind of a triumph, is still going to leave adult education with capacity gaps. And even if WIOA is kept at level funding, other cuts in other non-defense discretionary budget items are going to have ripple effects on state budgets and then on localities. And so from a standpoint of thinking about individual adult education programs, the three trends that you can imagine your grantees will be contending with are issues around stability and predictability of funding, right? One of the biggest challenges with Congress not passing regular spending bills and doing these short-term continuing resolutions is that it makes it hard to plan even one program year at a time, because you don't know whether you're going to have cuts that are retroactive to the beginning of your program year, right? We seem to have avoided that in FY17, but you never know if that might pop back up again in FY18. And so for that reason, private philanthropic funding becomes all the more important, because it's filling in these crucial gaps that sometimes people don't even know they have until they're halfway through their program year. The second implication for adult educators and programs on the ground is that they are being called upon to implement the new performance measures under WIOA and gather, in some cases, new data and report on new items without additional funds to do that. Right? We all know that data and outcomes reporting is critically important, but we also know that WIOA is currently not even funded at its full authorized level. And so for a lot of adult educators, the challenge is how can they ensure that they meet the WIOA data reporting requirements without jeopardizing their ability to provide the programs and services that are the reason that they're in business in the first place. And then the third challenge, frankly, that we're facing in adult education is the climate of uncertainty and, frankly, fear that a lot of adult learners are feeling, either because they've heard rumors about cuts to food stamps, because they've had actual cuts based on state budget crises in their state, or because they're immigrants and they're concerned about new trends around immigration enforcement. And I include documented immigrants in this fear, because we certainly see this happening in communities around the country. So those are some of the issues on the ground that adult education and literacy programs are dealing with, and that you as funders may be hearing from your grantees and your community members that they're already contending with. Next slide, please. I did also want to talk about what some of the implications are for funders in particular. So, we often talk about private funding as being the really critical mortar that fills in the cracks of public funding. In some cases now, private funding really is the bricks and the mortar, because public funding is just not stretching to cover all that it needs to cover. And for that reason, unrestricted general operating support is especially powerful and important for adult education organizations. One area that I think doesn't get enough attention is many localities have set ambitious goals around civic activities. So, for example, a goal around high school completion, a goal around post-secondary credential attainment. And not every community has fully, I think, incorporated the expertise and the assets that adult education brings to the table in thinking about how they meet those goals. So if you as a funder are engaged in conversations with your United Way, with your Rotary Club, with your state community college system, with your governor's office, with whomever may be setting collective impact goals or sort of city or county or community-wide goals around high school completion, around post-secondary credential attainment, thinking about how to more deliberately and intentionally weave in adult education, both as a thought partner and a sort of partner with expertise that they bring to the table, but also as a really important on-ramp, right? You can't start your post-secondary credential attainment conversation by saying, well, we assume everyone has a high school diploma or everyone is fluent in English. We know we can't start from that assumption. And we know that adult education is an absolutely critical part. It's the base of the pyramid in allowing all of those other education and career goals to be attained. And then the final area in which foundations, I think, have a really important role to play is in not just supporting grantees in participating in providing direct services through their programs, but also allowing grantees to use a portion of that money to participate in policy advocacy activities. And I want to be clear here, even if your foundation is not comfortable supporting lobbying as such, there is a specific legal definition of what lobbying is, and policy advocacy goes far beyond that, right? There's a much broader range of activities that can be advocacy that are not meeting the legal definition of lobbying that your foundation can still support. And I encourage those of you who are interested in supporting not just individually funding a service delivery program, as important as that is, but in creating a system where there's better, longer-term sustainable funding to do that using the tools that you have available to you. So I want to finish up by sharing a couple of resources that National Skills Coalition has available to you. Sort of looking forward in Congress, we are keeping our eye on the development of Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, as well as the Higher Education Act. We don't expect either of them to pass in Congress anytime soon, but we're certainly looking at how to create better and tighter adult ed on-ramps in both of those pieces of legislation. And in the next slide, you'll see some handouts and resources that NSC makes available for both adult education funders and other advocates. These three fact sheets are with regard to federal policies that can support adult ed, and they're available on our website at the URL you see on the screen. And in the next slide, there's a couple of resources related to a recent publication we did on foundational skills in the service sector, so adult learners with foundational skills gaps who work in retail, hospitality, or healthcare, and then adult education as a foundation for middle skill jobs. And the last area where we have resources available is in our state policy. Many of you may be familiar with the IBEST program. We did a scan of which states have statewide integrated education and training policies that go beyond what's required in WIOA. And we've published both a 50-state scan and a toolkit that provide resources both for foundations but also for individual service providers and advocates. And the website for that is also on this slide. So I want to make sure that we have time to get to Michelle's portion of the discussion. The last couple of slides here really just have my contact information and background, and you'll see those at the end of today's presentation, I think after Michelle's part. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Michelle, and then we'll go ahead and take questions when we get to the end of her portion of the webinar. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amanda. This is Michelle Beachik. I'm the Director of Programs at ProLiteracy, as Laura mentioned. And I'm going to, piggyback onto Amanda's presentation by talking a little bit about the perspective from the Adult Literacy Program. So I want to talk a little bit initially about ProLiteracy's network. Some of you may know, but ProLiteracy has about 1,000 members across the United States. They're in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. These programs vary quite widely in size and the types of services they provide. Approximately 60% of them are community-based organizations. And then others are associated with the traditional adult ed school system. Some are housed in libraries, religious institutions, and community colleges and other places. And all these programs are start and run autonomously. So we don't have any specific requirements from ProLiteracy, but we work very closely with them to help them provide services effectively. This network annually serves about 250,000 adult learners using 85,000 instructors. And those instructors could be paid or volunteer. Most programs use a combination of paid and volunteer instructors. This slide is just showing a little bit of the services that are provided by programs. Most programs provide basic literacy and ESL. But there are a lot of other ancillary instructional areas of instruction that support skills for adult learners, especially life skills and preparation for employment. Go back. Oh. Now it's important, I bring these up that you can see the basic literacy and ESL, the majority of programs that provide those, but some of these other areas of instruction, it's important for local programs to articulate to their funders that they provide these services, because many funders have a specific interest in some of these interest areas, such as financial literacy, computer-based instruction, they want to concentrate on math, etc. Now this, I want to point out that this is ProLiteracy's network. This is from a number of surveys that we do annually and throughout the year, but a lot of these types of instructions areas you see here are representative of the larger adult education network. Now this is taking a look at the funding picture for the ProLiteracy network in terms of public funding. So this shows the percentage of programs that have been, over the last 9 years, that have been receiving federal or state funding of some sort. A lot of the funding sources that Amanda mentioned in her presentation. Now it's important to note that in ProLiteracy's network, because we have a larger percentage of community-based organizations than the traditional adult education system, we do have a smaller number of programs that are generally receiving public funding. For traditional adult ed programs with the school system, the majority of that funding would be public funding, and they rely heavily on that for all of their operations. But I will say that the decline you're seeing, the general decline you're seeing in this slide here, over the last 9 years, that would mirror what you're seeing with the traditional adult education system as well. And also that you'll see that it'll match the slides that Amanda showed with that general decline over the last decade or so. While many programs may not receive federal or state funding, they do receive funding from some sort of local government source, or programs that don't receive any public funding, they may partner and collaborate regularly with programs that do receive that funding, as Amanda mentioned, in order to collaborate and get access to that funding. It's also important to note that because of this funding decline, many programs have been forced to merge or just close their doors. I thought it would be a little helpful to show a few of the sources of non-governmental funding, private funding. And so you could see that these are here. Programs rely really heavily on these types of funding. Amanda mentioned a little bit earlier about the unrestricted sources of funding. Those are critical to programs to being able to keep their doors open, frankly, and provide services on a regular basis. ProLiteracy works with its network to try to help them diversify their funding streams. But as you can see, it's a particular challenge in this funding environment with the federal funding going on a downward slide.
And then the one I wanted to mention, which will be on the next slide, is United Way. You can see here it's the fourth highest right now of non-governmental funding. But I took a look at over the last several years, and you can see that even the number of programs receiving United Way funding, which used to be their highest private funding source, is declining as well. So between what Amanda had mentioned at the federal level, the decline over the last decade, and even some of these major sources of funding changing, this is particularly challenging for programs. Now, United Way has changed some of their priorities, which many funders do, but it's a major challenge for local programs. Now, this chart is from a survey that ProLiteracy did about a year ago, just to gauge the interest and the needs that local programs are having. Now, it's important to note that this shows the needs that local programs are having to provide instruction. We asked this question, other than funding, what needs do you have? Because, of course, funding would be off the charts. So these are other needs that they have. You can see that the highest, of course, is more instructors or volunteers. About 2/3 of literacy programs are seeing waiting lists for students. They're not able to meet the need. So, of course, the need for instructors or volunteers is a major one for them. They're constantly seeking funding sources in order to hire new instructors or to even provide the ability for them to find new funding sources. The one I did want to point out that was in addition to the instructors and volunteers is research and statistics related to adult literacy. Many of you may be familiar with the PAC study program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which is a really good study that was done comparing the United States to other countries. But what still lacks is that information related to the study at a state or even local level that programs are not able to access. This gives a little bit of an idea of some of ProLiteracy's advocacy and awareness efforts. You know, we feel responsible at the national level to advocate on behalf of our member network in a number of ways. So some of those ways are some of the more traditional advocacy-related efforts, such as visits to members on the Hill, sharing and tracking information about legislative activity, and providing advocacy tools for our local programs to do that with their local legislators. Then there are some other areas where we feel that we need to address that are not related to public funding, which are editorial and print ads. We've had a couple of opportunities to have television interviews or TV shows that highlight the importance of adult literacy and the lack of knowledge around adult literacy by the general public. ProLiteracy is also a member of the National Coalition for Literacy, as is National Skills Coalition, Amanda's organization, and that's a national coalition of national and state agencies that work together to advocate for adult literacy and legislation, in terms of legislation and policies. And then the last slide I have is just showing a really quick snapshot of a recent white paper that we developed. I would put this in the category of some of our awareness and activity efforts. This is the information in this study, and I'd be happy to send it out to everybody after the presentation. Was based on some research done by Dr. Stephen Reeder at Portland University over a 10-year period. And it really talks about the return on investment in adult literacy in terms of student outcomes related to an increase in income, their increased chance of receiving a high school equivalency degree, or even advancing on to any other post-secondary education. To our knowledge, it's really an unprecedented study. We haven't seen this kind of longitudinal study in quite some time, if not ever. So it's really important for us to show funders and legislators this type of information, and so they understand the full return on investment for investing in adult education. I guess that brings us to our question slide. So,
yeah, thank you, Michelle and Amanda. We really appreciate the updates. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to enter them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. I don't think we have any, but I will hang on for a moment and see if anybody poses any questions. I thought this information was absolutely critical and really important for funders to hear, as well as programs. I think we do have some literacy programs on the line. While we're waiting for a question, I have one, just a clarifying question. Amanda, you had mentioned that the authorized level of WIOA, we're not actually at that level of spending. Could you go into that a little bit more and talk about what the authorized level versus the actual level is?
Sure. Congress sets a level in the 2014 legislation when WIOA was reauthorized. And just as a reminder for everybody, the Title II of WIOA is also known as the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, AFLA. And so the authorized level that's set is essentially where Congress can always fund above the authorized level should they want to change the authorization, but it's not even being funded up to that level. So the authorized level would be $635 million, but the actual level right now is $581 million. So it's not an enormous difference, but it is the better part of about 10% of what it could, it could be about 10% higher in terms of what additional money we could be seeing for adult ed. And of course, that's just with regard to WIOA. We all know that in many of the other programs that support adult education, they're also being funded below their authorized levels. And so Congress has room to grow in a lot of areas. And if that's an area that is close to your heart, I encourage you to contact your legislators and let them know that it's important to you that in the FY18 budget as it's being negotiated, that adult education be well represented and be funded at its full authorized level. I would also encourage folks, if you're not already, come to National Skills Coalition's website, nationalskillscoalition.org, and in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the Join Our Mailing List. And we encourage you to sign up for our mailing list so that you'll find out about action alerts and other things that you can do to take action quickly in support of adult education funding, not only at the national level, but we'll also send you updates for your state if there are bills in your state legislature that you can take action on that we're following.
Yes, we do have one question. This is Jameson Crawford. I'm a project manager here at ProLiteracy. How are urban areas versus rural areas being affected by the decline in federal and state funding? So essentially, what's the difference between urban and rural areas when it comes to funding?
Yeah, so the short answer is the president's skinny budget proposed to cut money from both cities and rural areas. So it was slash and burn of a lot of things. For example, the Appalachian Regional Commission, which has supported a lot of employment-related and skill-building opportunities across Appalachia, was slated for some cuts under the president's proposal. So whereas things like CDBG money and CSBG money are often going to communities of more than 100,000 people, not always depending on the specific requirements of the legislation, but often, and they're also seeing cuts. So I don't think we can say that the president's budget is singling out one group versus another. I think the challenge is just that, first of all, there's usually fewer philanthropic resources in rural areas because there's just fewer people and oftentimes fewer historic industries and so forth. And so that's a particular challenge for rural areas. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, is that there's often a less well-developed infrastructure in rural areas, meaning there might not be as much redundancy, right? There's maybe only one or two providers who can provide adult ed programs, and if folks don't have the transportation to get to classes at one of those locations, they may struggle to access adult education at all. So I think right now at this point, it's too early to tell whether there's going to be differential impact on rural areas versus urban areas in the FY18 budget because we haven't seen the president's full budget yet, but at least based on the skinny budget, frankly, the axe is falling on both rural and urban communities. And so frankly, there's a lot of shared advocacy, I think, that could be going on.
Yeah, and the only thing short, that I would add to that is that, we're probably seeing the same exact thing that Amanda was saying in our network, not much difference between rural and urban, but it's something we might want to look into once this new legislation is passed or possible new cuts are passed in 2018. We may want to reach out to our network to see if they're having additional challenges, but right now, not that I've seen either.
And our next question, are we seeing an increase in different fund development components when it comes to supporting a lot of these adult education programs?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say about that is something that's probably not a surprise to anybody on this webinar, and that is paying for a development director who can help you be creative about how you raise money is usually something that adult education programs are not allowed to do out of their public contracts, right? So in order to pay for that development director, you have to fundraise unrestricted revenue from other sources. But if you could fundraise revenue from those other sources, you might not need your development director. And so there's a bit of a catch-22 that happens for a lot of adult education programs. And it's one of the reasons that when private funders allow general operating support, unrestricted general operating support, it is so important because it allows those nonprofit agencies, those adult ed providers, to make their own decisions about how they would most like to spend the money they're receiving, and they can use it to support direct service delivery as well as to support staff positions that you can't legitimately pay for out of a government contract budget. But, you know, I think one of the other sort of questions / challenges is how do you go to how do you look in new directions for funding, right? If folks feel like their existing sources are tapped out, how can they look broader? And that is actually why I go back to that question of, are there broader civic goals, right? In Seattle, there's a citywide race and social justice initiative. That race and social justice initiative mandates that city governments look at the impact on race of how they're spending public money. So that becomes a lens that you can look through to say, is there more we should be doing around adult education to improve racial equity in Seattle? There are other communities that have set goals around 55% of our state or 60% of our county will have achieved a post-secondary credential by the year 2025. Right? The Lumina Foundation, as we all know, has been supporting a lot of those goals. There are places where United Ways and Rotaries have set local goals. If you can make an argument that adult education is part of the solution in meeting those local goals, that can also open up funding from sources that didn't previously conceive of themselves as wanting to support literacy work or support adult education, but they are on board for the broader civic goal that's been agreed upon by a set of partners, and having adult ed at that table is a way of getting access to those additional resources. So I would encourage folks to think as broadly and creatively as possible, particularly given the under-resourced environment that I know a lot of programs are operating in.
Yeah, and this is Laura. I'd like to just add on to that the Literacy Funders Network is working on a book, thanks to Frank Ridzi and Margaret Dowdy, that looks at collective impact. Does it work? What literacy coalitions tell us. This is a book that's being published through Lexington Press and will be released shortly. I don't have a date to share with people, but your comment, Amanda, made me think about literacy coalitions and collective impact. And I know that there's some coalitions on the call right now. I know that they're, looking at that broader scope of how do we show the importance of adult literacy in the pipeline of lifelong learning and education. And so I think it's important for funders, if you're not already thinking about literacy coalitions or other collective impact strategies in your communities, that you find those out, what's going on, and get to those tables and check out this book, of course, when it comes out, because Literacy Funders Network has done a lot of research and looked at this from many different lenses and from a historic view as well, and see that literacy coalitions do seem to move the needle.
Great.
So we don't seem to have any more questions in the queue right now. Again, if anybody does have a question, you can enter it in the questions box. If not, I am going to share the people's contact information. And you can feel free to contact Amanda, Michelle, or of course go on to the Literacy Funders Network website, find out about membership, and any other information that we've got up to share with you. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today. Amanda, Michelle, thank you very much. ProLiteracy team and Literacy Funders Network for putting this webinar together. In a couple of business days, you will receive a recording of this webinar. You'll also receive the deck, as well as a survey, which will ask just 5 questions about this webinar. We'll also be asking you, the Literacy Funders Network is interested in continuing this conversation, since we know it's going to be very critical, especially throughout the spring, as Amanda mentioned, with all the busyness of budgeting and seeing what happens. So that survey will ask you if you'd like to continue this conversation throughout the summer. And then our Literacy Funders Network Conference is going to be held October 9th through 11th in conjunction with the National Center for Families Learning, which will be held in Tucson, Arizona. Again, October 9th through 11th. Please feel free to check that out. We are very excited to continue this conversation and hope all those on the line will consider joining Literacy Funders Network and joining us in Tucson. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.